So why has the Dominican Republic succeeded when its neighbor Haiti has, well, utterly failed as a state? Same small island, two separate states, splitting said island practically right down the middle, but two completely different outcomes. It's interesting, my friends, because this is a question that a lot of you asked in my previous video that I did on Haiti, where we looked at why that particular 200-year-old country has never really been able to get any of its crap together and then stay together for any decent period of time, including literally right now, where it is by most definitions completely a failed state. Dozens of you were in the comment section asking why the Dominican Republic, despite being of similar size, sharing the other half of the same island as Haiti, has not experienced such a tragic outcome. And the answer, as always here on the History of Everything, is complicated, of course, and it requires context. But before it is that we get into how we got here, it is important that those of you who are watching this understand just how different things are and how quickly this became obvious. And when I say obvious, I mean very obviously obvious. The countries of Haiti and the Dominican Republic together form the island of Hispaniola in the Caribbean. Haiti comprises roughly the western third of the island, while the DR, Dominican Republic, makes up the eastern 2/3. The Dominican Republic is larger, at least in terms of landmass, than what you'd see with Haiti, but even despite that difference, for the majority of its history, it had actually a lesser population. And when you go and look at this, the economic divergence between these two countries is arguably one of the most remarkable in the entire world. In fact, the only example that I can probably think of that is close to Haiti and the Dominican Republic is literally North and South Korea. That is how stark of a difference we are talking here for something that is located in the exact same place and shouldn't be that different. In fact, as recently as the year 1960, the two countries had arguably similar standards of living. But today, the Dominican Republic, by some measures, is easily 5 to 10 times as rich as Haiti, while Haiti's standard of living hasn't really advanced at all since 1950. Yes, it is in fact that bad. For the past 70-odd years or so, Haiti's per capita GDP, when adjusted for inflation, has been pretty much hovering around $2,000, while the Dominican Republic would grow to over $11,000 this past year in 2025, surpassing Brazil. Really, when you go and look at this, it is impressive by just about any standard, but when you go and compare that to the absolute basket case that is its neighbor Haiti, it becomes even more baffling and sad. While the Dominican Republic is one of the fastest growing economies in Latin America, the Haitian government has struggled to keep control of the nation, with gangs having taken control of over 90% of the capital city and violence having spilled out into the country, with central systems of control having completely broken down and nothing seemingly working anymore. Haiti, as it is also ranked as one of the poorest nations in the world and is the poorest nation in the Americas. According to UNICEF, 59% of Haitians live under the poverty line, and they don't have access to basic services. This is an extremely high rate of poverty when compared to the Dominican Republic's poverty rate of 23.2% and the global average of 46.9%, so Haiti is really holding back the curb here. Which sounds awful, I know, but looking at the specifics of their economy, the stark differences are just plain to see. For the Dominican Republic, tourism is a massive industry, contributing over 15% of GDP and employing hundreds of thousands of people. The country is a top destination in the Caribbean with well-developed resorts and infrastructure. Haitian tourism? Well, it relied on it for a while, yes, but it collapsed in recent years, with travel advisories warning people to not go there lest you run the risk of being kidnapped by one of the many gangs that seem to run the state. Manufacturing-wise, the Dominican Republic is a major hub for free trade zone manufacturing, producing textiles, medical devices, cigars, electronics, all kinds of different basic as well as advanced goods that primarily are exported to the United States. Haitian manufacturing, on the other hand, especially with the key garment sector, has struggled for years with deep-rooted issues like political instability, rampant gang violence that are disrupting operations, extremely low wages at less than $5 a day, poor working conditions, harassment, theft, etc., union suppression, inconsistent law enforcement, infrastructure deficits, and so much more that have historically hurt all their local production, agriculture, and everything else, leading to job losses, factories closing, and reliance on unstable foreign investment that at any given moment can disappear, whether by the hands of a politician stealing it all Or the country that was looking investing just decides, yeah, no, this is not my problem. I'm not dealing with all this crap, and they back out. It's bad. The Dominican Republic has a robust financial sector, telecommunications, and construction industry. Haiti, on the other hand, had most of its investment and startup money stolen by gangs and corrupt politicians, thus severely limiting any kind of real development that could take place. Arguably, when you look at this, agriculture is really the only two things that they have in common, but even that is completely different. Yes, the Dominican Republic still has a significant agricultural base, producing sugar, coffee, cocoa, tobacco, and rice, but this is for both domestic consumption as well as export. For Haiti, agriculture is the largest employer, but this is mostly subsistence farming at this point and is highly vulnerable to droughts, floods, and soil erosion. Haiti manages to produce mangoes, coffees, and cocoa, yes, but they lack the infrastructure and investment to be a major export player, limiting any kind of real development that can take place. So it is then, my friends, that when you go and look at these two countries, they could not be any more different. But as I said earlier, the question, as always here on the History of Everything, is how exactly did we get here? Well, sit back and relax as we go and dive into the history of the Dominican Republic, the successful one among the Hispaniola siblings that its parents can't help but compare with its dysfunctional sister, Haiti. But speaking of things that create a lot of strong feelings on the internet, today's video has been sponsored by Venice AI. And yeah, I know, now hear me out here first, my friends. I know that there are a lot of strong feelings regarding AI, and look, I'll be blunt with you. I'm not going to advocate that, oh, you and I use it to replace people who are doing real work. I'm never going to say that. My employees that support me and my channel are human, and they are also here in the United States. I do not abuse foreign cheap labor. There was that one time I did tie up my editor in the basement, but that's besides the point. But either way, I do get the hesitation that people have when it comes to AI and feeding it your information. After all, OpenAI has even hinted that they may require government-issued IDs in the future, which, would you feel comfortable giving your ID to use ChatGPT? Probably not, but that is where Venice AI can be such a useful tool to support you, as it is private and completely uncensored. There are no content filters that holds it back or you back, and you can explore any topic, ask any question, and get a direct, unfiltered answer. It treats you like an adult who is actually capable of having a conversation, not a child. Which is nice, but the best part is that Venice is completely private. Your chats and data are stored only in your browser, never on any of their servers. You can create, brainstorm, and explore without a single worry about your data ever being tracked or stored, which that is crucial. And if you pay for the Pro plan, you unlock advanced tools like PDF uploads for instant summaries, which for any student, researcher, or professional that is going through 200 pages of government documents, that can be a godsend. Trust me, I know. You can do this by clicking my link down in the description and using my code HistoryOfEverything to get 20% off a Pro plan. Or just try the free version if you want. It's nice. Now, before the angry comments start swarming in, thank you, Venice AI, for sponsoring me on videos that regularly get demonetized, thus allowing me to actually pay my editor in order to feed his family, as well as my own. And now back to the show. To begin, we have to go back to the start of both nations when they were merely colonies of foreign powers. And yes, I'm not going to be going back in extensive detail because I have covered some of the overall history of the island in previous episodes when talking about Haiti. So yeah, again, we're not going to go into too much detail here. We have to focus more on the Dominican side, of course. To explain that, before the arrival of Europeans, the island that we would come to know as Hispaniola was inhabited by the Taino people, an Arawakan-speaking people who called the island Quisqueya, or the Mother of All Lands. In 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, he would go and land on the island, claiming it for Spain and naming it La Española, or Hispaniola. This would mark the beginning of a rather brutal colonial period, and the Spanish would establish the first permanent European settlement in the Americas at Santo Domingo in 1496 that immediately got to work. Or, I say that, everyone else kind of had to get to work. Yet the Taino population was decimated by forced labor, disease like smallpox, and violent suppression. To replace the dwindling indigenous labor force, the Spanish began to import enslaved Africans in the early 1500s. And as for the Spanish, well, they had more important things to do, like conquering the rest of the Americas. Santo Domingo became the springboard for the Spanish conquest of the Caribbean and the American mainland. However, as Spain's focus began to shift to the much wealthier colonies of Mexico and Peru, which had a lot more gold and silver, Hispaniola's importance would wane. So it was then, by the late 16th century, that the western part of the island had been largely abandoned by Spain, and instead it became a haven for French and Dutch pirates. In fact, this is the origin of Haiti that I never really went into detail about. France would eventually formally gain control of the western third of the island in 1697 under the Treaty of Ryswick, thus creating the French colony of Saint-Domingue, which is modern-day Haiti. That is how it came to be, but the remaining two-thirds of it was kept by the Spanish, even if the area was largely ignored and stayed much of a small backwater for many centuries. Really, when you go and look at these two areas now, it is almost a complete reversal of the wealth dynamics that you see of today. Because from this point, French Saint-Domingue became the most profitable colony in the world. Its brutal plantation system, powered by the labor of hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans, would produce vast quantities of sugar, coffee, and cotton. This French colony was incredibly wealthy, but as I explained here before, its society was built on extreme cruelty and a massive slave population that drastically outnumbered whites by more than 10 to 1. That, as you are aware of, again, because of my Haitian video, would cause things to go to absolute crap after the outbreak of the French Revolution, and from there, the Haitian Revolution. So it was then that after more than a decade of brutal warfare against the French, against the Spanish, and British armies, that rebels would finally defeat Napoleon's forces, and in 1804 would declare the independent nation of Haiti. This was the first free black republic in the entire world. And as for Spanish Santo Domingo, well, while the West was in turmoil, the Spanish-speaking eastern part would remain a poor, sparsely populated backwater, oftentimes referred to as Santo Domingo Español. It was recaptured by Spain back in 1809, but again, even past the point of taking over their colony once more, it was still largely ignored. But that was about to change. In the year 1821, a group of Creole elites in Santo Domingo would go and declare independence from Spain, creating a short-lived Spanish Haiti. Fearing Spain's return and wanting to secure the entire island, Haitian President Jean-Pierre Boyer would go and invade and unify the island under Haitian rule in 1822, thus beginning an occupation that would last 22 years and fundamentally change the island, severely embittering many Dominicans. This is a point of soreness for many Dominicans when looking back at history. As for how it went down, Boyer would go and abolish slavery across the island. He would go and redistribute land. He would attempt to consolidate the economy. He did every single thing that he could in order to do what he saw as improving it, at least in the mind of, again, the post-revolutionary Haitian mindset. He also would impose heavy taxes, seize food stores and other supplies, and made French the official language of government, completely alienating the Spanish-speaking Dominican elite. And so, with much of their land and power gone, the Dominican elite would deeply resent Haitian rule as a foreign occupation by a culturally and linguistically different people. From this, resistance movements began to form across the country. Most notably, the secret society, La Trinitaria, in the 1830s, that was led by an individual called Juan Pablo Duarte. This rebellion would gradually gain strength after a devastating earthquake in 1842, as well as the outbreak of civil war in Haiti, which, yeah, that was a common occurrence if you, again, saw from my last video. And so it was then in 1844 that independence was finally achieved, thus establishing the brand new Dominican Republic. But it wasn't going to be as simple as that. See, the problem was that the new nation was just about immediately plunged into chaos. It was weak, it was impoverished, and it faced the constant threat of reinvasion from Haiti. This period would see a series of devastating wars, as well as the rise of caudillos, regional military strongmen who would rule the entire country through force. And that is something that I'm going to need to explain. The most powerful caudillo among all of these was Pedro Santana, a wealthy landowner from the eastern region. Facing economic ruin and the threat of another Haitian invasion after he bankrupted the state, paying for a military to defend said state, gee, sound familiar? Santana would go and make a fateful decision. In 1861, he negotiated the re-annexation of the Dominican Republic to Spain. That's right, he recolonized the state. He believed that only the protection of a European power was going to be able to save the nation from Haiti, as well as its own internal divisions. As you can probably expect, the re-annexation was met with widespread outrage. Dominicans saw it as a betrayal of their hard-won independence, and as a result, a bloody guerrilla war would erupt across the country. Led by figures like Gregorio Luperon and Jose Antonio Salcedo, the Dominican fighters, called Resorados, would use their knowledge of the terrain to wage a relentless war against the superior Spanish army. So it was that after 2 years of brutal conflict and mounting casualties that Spain, faced with its own political instability, would finally withdraw its forces in 1865, and so the Dominican Republic was restored. Which, hey, alright, sounds awesome, right? Perfect. No, this really was an absolute shit show. See, by the time the Spanish had departed, most of the main towns lay in ruin, and the island was divided amongst several dozen different caudillos who pretty much controlled their own little areas like princedoms, in something that was more akin to a confederation of some type than a real nation. You would probably think that it wouldn't be very stable then, and yeah, you would definitely be correct. From the Spanish withdrawal to 1879, there were 21 changes of government and at least 50 different military uprisings. It is baffling just how much instability there was. And in the course of these conflicts, two parties would emerge. You had the Partido Rojo, literally the Red Party, led by Buenaventura Baez, and the Partido Azul, literally the Blue Party, led by Gregorio Luperon. And they didn't necessarily really like each other very much. Over the course of the wars and petty conflicts that would break out between the two sides, the small and corrupt national army was far outnumbered by militias that were organized and maintained by local caudillos who had set themselves up as provincial governors. These militias were filled out by poor farmers or landless plantation workers that were pressed into service, who then usually would take up banditry when not fighting in revolution. And so, as you can imagine, things were very, very, very bad and incredibly unstable. In fact, it was so bad that Baez, the leader of the Red Party, had approached the United States multiple times trying to, and I kid you not, sell the whole country, either being a protectorate to the US or just outright get it annexed. Like this happened multiple times over the Dominican Republic's history, where politicians would rise up, realize how much of an absolute crapshoot it was, and be like, man, I don't want this, and then try to sell out the entire country. As for how that went, well, President Ulysses S. Grant would favor annexation, sure, but the US Senate would fail to ratify the treaty by one vote. So yeah, the thing that is not really mentioned is that the Dominican Republic could have easily been a territory of the US in the same way that Puerto Rico is. Absolutely wild. Anyway, the instability would continue during the 1870s. Ulysses Espaillat, an idealistic reformer, was elected president, and then he was overthrown in 1876. This would mark the country's first, though very short-lived, democratic government. After that, Baez would return to the presidency for a fifth time from 1876 to 1878, but he too was also forced out. A period of civil unrest with a series of presidents would follow, out of which would emerge Ulysses Heró, who would dominate the country as dictator from 1882 all the way to 1889. And this, my friends, is where things really begin to start to change. You see, Heró ruled over a time of what you could arguably say was unprecedented stability and national growth. His regime would build new roads, they would dig irrigation canals, they would increase agricultural production, they would bring in a great amount of foreign investment. They would do all these things that, yes, they were truly impressive. But also remember, he was definitely a brutal dictator. He created a fearsome secret police. He restricted the press. He controlled the economy through monopolies. He would take out massive foreign loans, which would plunge the nation into debt, and he would commit blatant electoral fraud. Oh, dear God. Wow. Actually, the more that I do this video, the more that I realize just how incredibly similar Haiti and the Dominican Republic were. Like, if you go and compare their history from everything that I'm about to explain, it almost feels like a one-to-one comparison of the exact same things happening. This could, with few exceptions, actually be a one-to-one comparison. Anyway, Heró was assassinated in 1899 by Ramón Cáceres, this being a rival politician, and the country after that point would return to its chaotic politics of the past, with new leaders coming in and then almost immediately being forced out for one reason or another. The nation's finances were in complete ruin due to Heró's massive foreign debts, and something had to be done. And so, the nation actually sort of came together, in a way, kind of. What I mean is that to prevent further civil war, the two main political parties, the Reds and the Blues, would go and establish a power sharing agreement known as the Turno Politico. The idea being that they would peacefully alternate the presidency. In practice, it failed completely. Both sides would accuse each other of fraud, and this would lead to constant political turmoil, revolts, and other economic decline. It didn't work. They tried, it really didn't work. Because of this, eventually, the Dominican Republic would default on its European loans, and Germany, Italy, and Belgium would threaten military intervention to collect the money that they were owed. To preempt this, the United States would invoke the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, and it would take control of the country's customs collections in 1905. This meant that essentially all import revenue was managed by the United States to pay off foreign debts, leaving the Dominican government with very little operating capital. While yes, this did stabilize the debt, it also was a massive blow to national sovereignty and was something that deeply upset the population. And an upset population typically doesn't mean stable politics. In fact, the political chaos would reach a breaking point in 1916. After a series of coups and counter-coups, the US President, Woodrow Wilson, who was tired of all the crap, would finally order the military occupation of the country. The US Marines would go and land, they would disband the Dominican Army, and they would establish a military government much in the same way that they had done in Haiti. Again, when I'm talking about this, my friends, same time period, practically the exact same reasons, the countries are remarkably similar. For anyone who's only half paying attention, it might actually feel like I'm just doing a repeat of my Haitian video. I am not. The stated goals of the United States were to restore order, to create a stable democratic government, and to protect US financial interests. Naturally, the US would reorganize the nation's infrastructure, they would build roads, schools, and a professional police force, which later became the Dominican Army. This did help, but the occupation was deeply unpopular. A guerrilla resistance movement known as the Guerrilleros would spring up in the eastern provinces, and led by figures like Ramon Natera, they would wage a bloody campaign against the Marines for years. The US, in turn, would respond with harsh counterinsurgency tactics. Ultimately, the occupation would end in 1924. The US would oversee the election of Horacio Vasquez, who was himself seen as a moderate that would maintain order, and that was pretty much that. The US would withdraw, and they would leave behind a new US-trained military force that, while competent, yes, the people also had a deeply ingrained resentment of any kind of foreign intervention. So it was then, my friends, that the United States occupation created the very instrument that would define the Dominican Republic for the next 31 years. A powerful, centralized military. And that, while initially good for stability, is something that in an unstable society can create opportunity. Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina, a former telegraph operator who had risen through the ranks of the new national police, was perfectly positioned from this to seize power. To explain that, after Vasquez was overthrown in a coup in 1930, Trujillo, then the head of the army, would run a fraudulent election for president. He officially took office in August of 1930, and from there, his regime began immediately, quickly establishing what was arguably one of the most absolute dictatorships in the entire world. And that is saying something. Like, this is the 1930s, and it is the era of dictatorships, so I'm going to need to explain this. First up, he establishes a cult of personality. He renamed the capital city Ciudad Trujillo, like literally Trujillo City, and the highest mountain was Pico Trujillo. His portrait was everywhere. The national anthem was rewritten to praise him. Through intimidation and outright theft, Trujillo and his family would take control of nearly every profitable industry in the entire country, from salt to sugar to insurance to banking, everything. He would amass a personal fortune estimated to be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And if you somehow stood against him, good freaking luck. His secret police, the SIM, the Servicio de Inteligencia Militar, was everywhere. It was omnipresent. Torture, assassinations, disappearances, all of these were routine tools for eliminating any and all opposition. And that is not even really the worst of it. The darkest stain on Trujillo's regime was the massacres that he launched. In a paranoid nationalist frenzy to Dominicanize the border, he would order the army to massacre Haitians and Dominicans who were of Haitian descent. It was a brutal affair. The death toll was estimated to be anywhere between 5 to 20,000 people, and this act of ethnic cleansing would permanently scar the relationship between the two nations. Again, if we draw comparisons to how Haiti had been run and operated, very similar. By the late 1950s, Trujillo's regime was becoming an international pariah. The Organization of American States, the OAS, would impose sanctions after an assassination attempt against Venezuelan President Romulo Betancourt, which Trujillo had orchestrated. The final blow would come on May 30th, 1961, when Trujillo was ultimately ambushed and assassinated by a group of conspirators. That included some of his own associates. This would be the end of him. And it's at this point here, my friends, that we need to really recall back to the beginning of this video when we said that in 1960, the GDP per capita adjusted for inflation for both Haiti and the Dominican Republic was around $2,000. So far, just about everything between the two states has been remarkably similar, at least in terms of how crap everything was. But now, things were actually going to start to diverge. Okay, no, I say that before they could get better, things were going to get significantly worse. The reason I say that is that Trujillo's death did not bring immediate peace. It instead unleashed a power struggle between his family, who tried to maintain control, and the reformist factions that had been suppressed for literally decades. After a brief interim government led by Trujillo's son, the country would hold its first free elections in December of 1962. And the winner of that was Juan Bosch, a leftist intellectual and writer who had been in exile for decades, who was then inaugurated in February of 1963. Bosch's reformist agenda, including land reform, labor rights, and a new constitution, was all deemed a bit too radical, we will say, for the country's elite, for the Catholic Church, and especially the US-trained military. Just 7 months after taking office, he was overthrown in a military coup. That coup would spark a popular uprising. In April of 1965, constitutionalists that were loyal to Bosch and the 1963 Constitution would rise up in arms against the military-backed loyalists. A full-scale civil war would erupt in the streets of Santo Domingo. This was very clearly not a good situation, and fearing a second Cuba being created in the Caribbean, President Lyndon B. Johnson would order 42,000 U.S. troops to invade the Dominican Republic. The official justification was, of course, to protect American lives and stop a communist takeover, because remember, this is the Cold War. But the primary goal was to prevent Bosch supporters from winning the Civil War. The U.S. forces would occupy the country, creating an intergovernment zone in the capital, and from there negotiate a peace settlement. As things were stabilized, the U.S. would oversee new elections in 1966, the winner of which was Joaquin Balaguer, a former Trujillo protege who presented himself as a bulwark against communism, which, yeah, always a popular thing when being supported by the U.S. in the literal Cold War. He seems to have gotten quite a lot of extra support, we will say. So it was then, my friends, that Joaquin Balaguer would go on to dominate Dominican politics for arguably the next 30 years. And this, interestingly enough, would be a period of paradoxes. Yes, you had relative stability and economic growth, but this was also mixed with authoritarianism and repression. If anything, again, you could compare it at the same time in Haiti under Papa Doc and his son, except in that country, you had a voodoo kleptocracy that was created to steal literally every ounce of wealth that the country could produce, while in the Dominican Republic, it was more of a classic authoritarian regime, with an emphasis on construction projects and pandering to foreign powers for investments. Which, yes, I'm going to need to explain that, because this, as you could probably guess from how I describe those two things, is where things really begin to diverge. Balaguer's first 12 years in power were characterized by political control and economic development. While elections were held, they were widely marred by fraud and intimidation. Balaguer would control the media and the military, and his opponents were oftentimes harassed or exiled. But at the same time, he also presided over a period of significant economic growth, funded by foreign aid, tourism, and large-scale public works projects. He would build dams, he would build highways, public buildings, all of these different things which would earn him the nickname, the Builder. Which, yeah, that does sound great, and in a way, it really was. But also, remember, this development was oftentimes used for political patronage for regime insiders, and it did very little to alleviate widespread poverty. So even if the overall GDP was going up, things weren't necessarily improving all that much for the everyday Dominican. And that was rather frustrating. And so it was then, seeking change in 1978, that the people would vote in a landmark election, The Dominican Revolutionary Party, or PRD, led by Antonio Guzman, would defeat Balaguer. And for the first time ever, the sitting president would peacefully transfer power to an opposition candidate. This was a major milestone for Dominican democracy, which is awesome. And Guzman would move from here cautiously to try and implement some reforms, which arguably, again, is awesome. But oligarchic elements would remain very powerful, and the economy was extremely fragile. A hurricane would devastate the country in 1979, and the faltering economy produced inflation. It produced strikes and very depressed conditions. So it was that Guzman would be succeeded by another PRD candidate, Salvador Jorge Blanco, who served as president from 1982 to 1986. There was nothing necessarily extremely special about this. It was just impressive that the country managed to complete 8 years of actual democratic government, the longest in its history to that point. But the problem was that Jorge Blanco was faced with falling sugar prices on world markets, widespread corruption in the government, horrible bureaucracy, and an economic recession. In an attempt to stabilize the economy, he would initiate an unpopular austerity program that would produce strikes and food riots. And, as a result, the aging, and by then, I'm not kidding, basically blind Balaguer, he was re-elected president again in 1986. That's right, baby. He's back. And he is basically senile and blind by this point. He can't do anything. In the 1990 election, he would narrowly defeat Bosch, despite the country's continuing economic difficulties, as well as fears that with how old he was and with his declining health, that this would create instability. He still gets elected. The opposition claims fraud in 1990 as well as 1994, when Balaguer would again win, but this time narrowly, and in response, protests would break out. And this very well could have been the end of it all. But that is actually not what happened. To avoid a political crisis, a pact was negotiated. Balaguer would serve a shortened 2-year term, and new elections would be held again in 1996. This would in turn pave the way for the 1996 election of Leonel Fernandez of the Dominican Liberation Party, the PLD, a protege of Balaguer, making the first ever truly modern and stable democratic transition. This is really important to specify here, my friends, because it is here that the changes that we have slowly been seeing taking place begin to rapidly speed up, and the differences between Haiti and the Dominican Republic become extremely more pronounced. To explain that, the PLD's ideology was a form of modern center-left social democracy, if you will. That is what it was on paper. But in practice, Fernandez's government was technocratic and pro-business. He was a lawyer, not a soldier or a traditional populist politician. His vision was to integrate the Dominican Republic into the global economy through technology, through finance, through tourism, things that would allow them to move away from the agrarian, state-led models of the past. And to that end, Fernandez's initial term from 1996 to 2000 was all about laying the groundwork for this. And that was going to be a tall order. You see, Fernandez had inherited an economy that was still reeling from Balaguer's massive public spending. His government would implement austerity measures, they would pursue privatization of some state-owned enterprises, and they would focus on attracting foreign direct investment. From doing all this, the currency was able to be stabilized and inflation was brought under control. Things were going to make a positive change. His most visible projects were in telecommunications and infrastructure. He would champion the development of fiber optic networks, he would expand the country's internet capacity, and begin the initial planning for the Santo Domingo Metro, a project that would become a symbol of modernization. So many things were being done, and his overall goal was to improve the Dominican Republic's standing on the world stage, positioning it as being a stable and reliable partner in the Caribbean, something that foreign powers would be willing to invest in because it wasn't going to overthrow itself in a civil war or gang violence every couple of years. After that, the possibilities were essentially endless, but of course, you can't exactly do all of that in just 4 years. So it was then that in the year 2000, prevented by the Constitution from running consecutively, Fernandez would step aside, and the election was won by Hipólito Mejia of the Dominican Revolutionary Party, or PRD. Now, Mejia was arguably the antithesis of the reserved intellectual Fernandez. He was a charismatic guy. He was a populist leader. He was an agronomist who easily connected with the rural and urban poor, and that is who he was going to focus on. To that end, Mejia's government would dramatically increase social spending. He would implement subsidies on food and fuel. He would expand credit to farmers and would launch ambitious social programs. And this, as you could probably guess, would make him extremely popular initially, and it fueled a period of strong economic growth as spending money does in fact increase GDP. But there's a little bit of a problem. The foundation of this boom was dangerously fragile. The Mejia government's lax regulation and political patronage would allow several major banks to engage in massive fraud and operate with essentially insolvent balance sheets. The collapse of Banco Intercontinental, or Baninter, was the tipping point. It was revealed eventually that the bank's owners had defrauded depositors of over $2.2 billion. And mind you, the total GDP of the Dominican Republic in the year like 2002 was, I mean, the numbers kind of vary depending on the source that you're looking at, but maybe around 26 or $27 billion. And that would plummet after everything came out. We were talking like this one bank stole the equivalent of like 1/13 of the entire economy. As a result, the government was forced to guarantee all deposits to prevent a total financial meltdown, a decision that would cost the state an astronomical sum of money. The national debt would balloon, the peso would collapse, and the economy would plunge into severe recession, losing, and I kid you not, 15% of its total GDP in 1 year. At that level of drop, we're not even talking about a recession anymore. We're talking about an utter crash. And this crisis completely erased the gains of Mejia's earlier term, and it discredited his government, paving the way once more for Fernandez to return. Yes, that is right, my friends. Leonel Fernandez would return to the presidency in 2004 to a country that he had literally just fixed the economy of. It got broken, and now he had to do it again. He had a very clear mandate. Fix it. If he didn't fix the economy, the country well could have gone the way of Haiti. How is he going to do that then? Well, by doing basically everything. No slowing down. Just doing everything and anything. We are talking tourism, construction, mining, remittances, everything. If there was a chance to make some cash, the government was absolutely going to do it, and they were going to have the time, this time, to act. His next 2 terms, secured after a controversial constitutional amendment allowing consecutive re-election, would define the era and give the government a chance to dive in full force. And let me explain. The late 2000s heading into the early 2010s were going to be a period of massive change for the Dominican Republic. Massive foreign investment would transform the eastern coast, that of Punta Cana and Bávaro, into one of the world's premier tourism destinations. A construction boom, fueled by both public and private investment, would reshape the skylines of Santo Domingo and Santiago. The Pueblo Viejo gold mine, one of the largest in the world, was reopened and became a major source of government revenue. Money that was sent home from the vast Dominican diaspora in the United States as well as Europe became a pillar of the economy, providing a stable flow of foreign currency that, instead of being mostly stolen by gangs or corrupt politicians, could instead primarily be used to fuel domestic business. Anything and everything was done, and the change was massive, with the Dominican economy experiencing spectacular growth, averaging over 7% annually for several years. Which, yeah, it sounds amazing. It absolutely was. People could see the changes that were happening, and this all but guaranteed the PLD's hold on power. But what is it that they say about absolute power corrupting absolutely? This political dominance was accompanied by an explosion in corruption. When massive amounts of money are constantly flowing, people are going to dip their hands in. And that has been the way that things have been for years and arguably still are to this day. The growth was still there, yes, but some people could see that there were severe structural problems still in place. By the time that 2012 rolled around, Fernandez was pressured by supporters to run for another consecutive term. He chose not to do so, and instead threw his support to the PLD colleague of his, Danilo Medina. Medina was a skilled political operator who had served as Fernandez's chief of staff and was very different from him. What I mean by that is that Medina was more low-key and pragmatic. While continuing the pro-business economic model of his forebears, he put a much stronger emphasis on social policy. His flagship program was an ambitious education reform known as the Full School Day policy, which involved building thousands of new schools across the country to extend school hours and improve quality. Now, this was popular, and he was widely praised for doing this and this initiative. But at the same time, his government was also rife with corruption, and his legacy would also arguably be defined by the Odebrecht scandal, as well as the Haitian migration issue. To explain what it is that I mean, the Brazilian construction giant, Odebrecht, would admit in a global plea bargain to paying nearly $100 million in bribes to Dominican officials to secure massive infrastructure contracts, including parts of the metro and highways. In fact, side note here, this was not just in the Dominican Republic. I need to stress that right now. This was all across Latin America that they were doing this. I should do an episode on that Odebrecht scandal by itself. But either way, the scandal would implicate high-level officials from across the political spectrum. But it also tarred Medina's government, which had overseen many of these deals. This fueled public anger and created a demand for a genuine alternative to the two-party system. And eventually, that was going to happen. But at the same time, socially, the problems with Haiti by this point were becoming far more pronounced. If you recall from my previous episode, Haiti by the 2010s was a bit of a basket case, with an earthquake in 2010 as well as a hurricane in 2012 destroying vast amounts of the country, killing hundreds of thousands of people, and sending people fleeing. Many over the past several decades have fled across the border to occupy parts of the Dominican Republic, much to the anger of its government and its people. In the year 2013, there was legislation that stripped Haitians born in the Dominican Republic of Dominican citizenship, rendering them subject to expulsion. Responding to the criticism over this law, in 2014, the government would modify it to allow individuals that were born to unauthorized foreign parents and whose birth had not been officially registered to apply for residency permits as foreigners, with the option of then applying for naturalization after 2 years. Changes to the so-called regularization program would also make eligible for residency non-citizens who could prove that they had arrived in the Dominican Republic before October of 2011. More recently arrived unauthorized immigrants would continue to be picked up and expelled from the country. It was a very controversial time. And of course, me saying that, everything that I have been saying here so far, I have focused on more of the controversial parts. Yes, that is true, but I do not want to give you the idea that I am giving this guy an unfair shake and that he was bad, because things are more complex than that. The economy continued to thrive under his presidency, with GDP growing by 7% in 2015 alone, according to most accounts. In the process, Medina's popularity would soar, and in June of 2015, the Constitution was amended again to allow him to run for a consecutive term. In the May 2016 election, Medina would win an overwhelming victory. By capturing more than 60% of the vote, he not only preempted the need for a second round by winning an absolute majority, but also he garnered the largest portion of the vote in the history of the Dominican presidential elections. He was so popular that his supporters were even floating the idea of him running for a third term in 2020, except, well, that's when COVID happened. And pretty much no politician was popular during COVID. In fact, for the Dominican Republic, things were arguably significantly worse. It was among the Caribbean countries hit hardest by the global coronavirus pandemic, as its reliance on things like tourism would be a severe weakness. Criticism of Medina's response to the resultant health crisis would contribute to the PLD's disappointing performance in the 2020 national election, which was postponed from May until July because of the pandemic. The end result of all of this then was a bit of a political earthquake, to say the least. Luis Abinader, leader of the Modern Revolutionary Party, PRM, which was a breakaway from the PRD, would win on a platform of transparency, anti-corruption, and competent management. His victory was seen as a rejection of the old guard. This was no longer a two-party system, and changes were coming. By September of 2021, an investigation by the government's anti-corruption office into alleged corruption by members of Medina's administration had tied 4 lawmakers to money laundering and drug trafficking. 9 officials ended up getting suspended or removed from office as a result of this investigation, and along with this, in early 2021, Abinader would announce that a wall was going to be built along the Dominican Republic-Haiti border to combat illegal migration as well as illicit trade. That's right, he was pulling a Trump. And this was going to become crucial, as remember, July of 2021 is where Jovenel Moise, the president of Haiti, was assassinated by mercenaries, and the whole country descended into gang-fueled chaos. As such, Abinader's first year in office, 2021, was going to set the tone for his administration, with three primary main pillars. One, fixing the economy. Two, a zero-tolerance approach to corruption. And three, a strong emphasis on security. To explain this, first we have the economy. The Dominican economy would rebound spectacularly from the pandemic. In 2021 to 2022, it was one of the fastest-growing economies in all of Latin America and the Caribbean. This recovery was primarily fueled by the resurgence of tourism, which returned to pre-pandemic levels much faster than expected, along with strong performance in construction, remittances, and free trade zone manufacturing. Abinader's government would capitalize on this, promoting the country as being a stable and safe destination for foreign investment. Secondly, a central promise of Abinader's campaign was to tackle the epidemic corruption that had plagued the previous administrations. Since 2021, his government has pursued this with high-profile actions, as several members of the high-level officials from Danilo Medina's administration were arrested and prosecuted for charges of embezzlement, money laundering, and fraud related to public contracts. While yes, critics are going to argue that these actions were also politically motivated, which they probably also were, they were widely praised by the public that was weary of just how politicians could act without impunity. And thirdly, and arguably this is something that is the most crucial in relation to Haiti, the gang and Haitian problem. Recognizing that citizen security is a top concern, Abinader would appoint a new hardline military leadership to the police force. The government would launch aggressive operations against criminal gangs, especially in large urban centers like Santo Domingo and Santiago. This iron fist approach has been popular with many citizens, but it has also drawn criticism from human rights organizations that are concerned about due process and potential abuses, especially in relation to the Haitian population. What I mean by that is that the flagship policy of the administration was the construction of a sophisticated border wall along the 392-kilometer or 244-mile border with Haiti. This wall, topped with fencing and equipped with motion sensors and surveillance technology, is designed to curb illegal immigration, smuggling, and cross-border crime. In late 2022, after a cholera outbreak was declared in Haiti, the Dominican government would temporarily close its border and suspend the issuance of visas to Haitian nationals, demonstrating just how effective these controls could be. The project itself really appears to be a physical manifestation of the government's hardline stance, and that is something that is very popular by a large percentage of the Dominican population. For those Haitians that have gotten into the country since mid-2022, the government has intensified deportation efforts. Dominican immigration and military forces have conducted regular raids on neighborhoods and workplaces with large Haitian populations. Those that are found without legal documentation are often summarily deported. Furthermore, the government has contracted repatriation flights to return Haitian migrants directly to Port-au-Prince. The only time that they couldn't really do this was at that one point where Haitian gangs had temporarily taken over the airport. But yeah, that did happen. And so then, it is here, my friends, that it brings us to the final things that we can really say to compare these two states. Because things could not be any more different. In Haiti, things never really were great, but security would sharply deteriorate after the assassination of President Jovenel Moise in 2021. Since that point, there have been no publicly elected officials in Haiti. A transitional presidential council created to organize elections and reestablish order is something that has been largely ineffective and mired in corruption allegations. A UN-backed security force of around 1,000 mainly Kenyan police officers has failed to really do anything to stop the violence. Gangs control vast swaths of the country. Economic activity has crashed. Few dare to go outside after dark, and the UN estimates that over half the population can barely feed themselves. It is, by just about every standard, a failed state. The Dominican Republic, by contrast, is booming. Living standards are rising faster than anywhere else in Latin America. Tourism and remittances account for nearly a third of their GDP. At Las Americas Industrial Park, a free trade zone outside of Santo Domingo, manufacturers churn out everything that one could possibly need, from basic everyday goods and clothes to pacemakers for heart surgeries. Politically, the two could not be any more different. Last year, President Luis Abinader would win re-election with 57% of the vote. Power would alternate between a handful of parties, but all share a commitment to market-friendly policies mixed with, of course, some corrupt acts for patronage to grease the wheels of industry. Yeah, that of course is something that angers your everyday Dominicans. Because while overall the numbers that I've been talking about here have been really good for the Dominican Republic, inflation as well as the rising cost of living have hit the poor and middle class pretty hard in recent years. And the benefits of tourism and its boom have not necessarily trickled down to significantly reduce the country's stark inequality. Like poverty may be reduced, but those with wealth are getting significantly richer than those who are not. But when asked about how they would compare their situation with Haiti, Dominicans are not exactly going to complain too much. In fact, that has arguably been one of the saving graces of the government, that even if something is not great, all they have to do is point their finger over the border and say, hey, well, at least we are not Haiti. It's a civil war over there. They're killing each other. And yeah, they're pretty much right. To that end, last year in 2024, the Dominican government would deport 276,000 Haitians, many of Haitian descent that had been born in the Dominican Republic. This is a trend that would continue over the course of 2025, and very likely well into 2026, unless something should somehow magically change in Haiti. But as you saw from our previous video, we have covered why that seems unlikely. In the end, the veritable economic and political chasm between the Dominican Republic and Haiti is a direct result of decades, if not centuries, as we've explained, of diverging paths. The Dominican Republic's relative stability, its investment in infrastructure and education, and successful integration into the global economy have created a positive cycle of growth and development. In contrast, Haiti has been trapped in a vicious cycle of political instability, with multiple kleptocratic governments treating the treasury as a personal piggy bank. Underinvestment in its society and industry has left much of the country destitute. Environmental degradation has worn it away, and external shocks have crippled its economic potential, leaving it as the poorest nation in the Americas. The two countries, neighbors on the same tiny island, are just a powerful real-world example of how governance, policy, and stability can change everything. And unfortunately, Haiti has the short end of the stick. Some from outside powers, but a lot of it due to its own internal problems. The Dominican Republic, on the other hand, is a success story. As for how that could potentially change in the future, we don't necessarily know. But if they continue on the path that they are, then really, the sky is the limit. With that all being said here, my friends, thank you all for watching. I really do appreciate it. Let me know in the comment section below what other kind of things that you all would like to do. This is the first one I've done here in a while that isn't necessarily based off a story that has just popped up. So if you have any good suggestions of things that you want me to cover, definitely let me know, because there's a lot more things for us to cover that isn't just based off what is going on in the news. Thank you, and I'll see you all here next time. Goodbye, and have a good rest of your day.